read for an hour, fell asleep for 15 minutes, read for an hour.
Can sleep. Well, they're ready.
For what?
We're ready to start now.
Yeah.
Could you tell us your name, please?
I'm Bert Gosschalk.
And where were you born and when?
I was born in 1920 in a little village by the name of Weije in Holland, in the eastern province of Overijssel.
Well, could you tell me some about what it was like for your family growing up in Holland? Some about your family?
You mean my parents and
Right.
I as a part of
Yeah.
the family or of my own family? Yes.
No, growing up, your
Growing
parents
up.
and brothers
Well,
and sisters.
The first few years of my life, like every normal human being, I think I don't remember very much of it. As a child of about 2 or 3, we moved to a nearby town, and that's where I did my growing up. I went there to school and to college. And
What was the name of this town that you moved to?
in Dutch pronounced it would be Deventer. Deventer. And it's an old town with a lot of history. It's located on the banks of a branch of the River Rhine. It's a lovely old town, and still, if I think back, that is where my youth was.
What about brothers and sisters in your family?
I came out of a family of 5. I had 2 brothers, 2 sisters. And very rare what happened to us is that all 5 of us survived the war.
Goodness. Where do you fit in the order of this family?
I'm the second one.
Okay.
I have an older sister who still lives in Holland with her family. I have a younger brother in Holland also. I have a younger sister who lives in Wales, and my other brother, also younger, died a few years ago in Texas.
What did your father do for his business as you were
My ancestors always have been connected somehow or another with cattle, as butchers, as merchants, as traders, or as wholesalers. My grandfather started in the very early part of this century a packing house in that little village of Weije where I was born. He had 5 sons, and all the 5 sons were in the business also, including my father. When my grandfather died a few years later, they decided to sell the business off, and my father then had his own packing house, which basically is buying cattle, butchering and packing it, and then selling it wholesale, primarily in Holland, Belgium, and Germany. In the same city where I grew up, that's where the move came in. All my uncles were in the same line of business on their own, all packing houses. And the packing house that my grandfather started is still today in production now as part of a larger concern. I was there a few years ago. I visited with my youngest daughter. She got a beautiful welcome there with flowers, and but the company still exists under different names, but it is still there.
Would you could tell us some about the religious aspect of your family? What it was like growing up?
Well, the first few years in the little village where we lived, we were the only Jews in town. But I have no memory of it except what I have heard being told. When I grew up as a young boy in Holland, in the city of Deventer, my parents, like most of the Jews that I knew, were religious, were very religious. My mother kept a kosher home, and all the holidays were strictly observed. I myself, as a youngster, every child in Holland has to go to school, obviously, same as here. But school hours were there from 8:30 in the morning till 12. Then was a break for lunch. Everybody went home for lunch. There was no cafeteria in school. There was no way of bringing your sandwiches to school. You had to go home, eat lunch, and by 1:30 you had to be back till 4. That was your school day, except Wednesday afternoon was off, but Saturday morning there was school. But after school, at 5 o'clock, I had to go to religious school every day of the week, with the exception of Friday and Saturday. But you shouldn't be all that happy about not having to go on Friday and Saturday, because instead you had to go to the synagogue on Friday evening for the Sabbath, and on Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon. And then to make it all round, you had to go on Sunday morning from 8 to 12. So I had a very, I won't call it broad, but thorough religious education.
Did you feel any adverse feelings about being Jewish in your town?
Not adverse, no. Holland has been a country through the ages of a lot of liberty, a lot of freedom, a lot of easier living. There was no anti-Semitism to speak of, except you felt to be a little different. One is other kids could go playing at 4 o'clock after school. I had to go to religious school. Other kids might have something to eat. I couldn't eat anything unless it was approved by my mother first. I don't know whether you want to have this said on screen, yes or no. You can edit it out later on if you want to. But I was the only Jewish kid in my class of about 24, 25 kids. And if we had to go to gym or swimming, I was always somewhat embarrassed to undress with all the other kids, because I was the only one that was circumcised. None of the rest was. And so there were quite a few kids that were very curious about that and had to have another look at it. That was the only way I found myself to be somewhat different from the rest of the kids. Otherwise, no.
Well, you were a young adult before the war started. What were you doing once you finished?
Well, I was still, I was in school till 1939. Then I started as an apprentice, as a student almost, in a large packing house and a company of which the president was a close friend of my father's. I was getting a management education there. Not only were they packing meat, but also making sausages, cold meats, canning, but also canning not only meat products, but vegetables, fruit, and then start making jams and jellies and things like that. Dry soup. From one thing always came another. The same company, however, well, that's another story. In 1924, 2 Canadian doctors, Dr. Benting and Dr. Best, invented the insulin to be made from the pancreas of animals. Now, the pancreas, amongst other glands, was always thrown away up to then. Since in this big slaughterhouse, thousands of pancreases every day became available, the company said, hey, why don't we start making insulin? It is not licensed, anybody can do it. And so they started what is today a very large international pharmaceutical concern, where I, after the war, started working.
How did things begin to change for you and your family when the war started? Or when did you notice change?
Well, of course, living next door to Germany, we were fully aware by newspapers and radio. There was no television in those days, but newspaper and radio would keep us fully informed about what was going on in Hitler Germany. And we knew it was bad, and we knew, we saw refugees coming through, people that were fleeing from Germany, whether to Holland or to other countries, and eventually overseas to England or to America if they could. Many of them stayed in Holland, glad to be away from Germany. We were aware of it, but it didn't touch us. Holland in World War I remained neutral, even though it was next door to Germany. Belgium was, of course, war theater, so was France, so was Italy, was Germany, but Holland and Switzerland were two neutral countries, and the Dutch lulled themselves to sleep by thinking, oh, we'll remain neutral again. Nobody's going to touch us. Hey, we don't want war. Nobody's going to touch us. They're not going to come here. On May the 10th of 1940, when I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning, I was already behind the German lines. The Germans had already run through town, crossed the river, and were already on their way further. We were already then in occupied country.
So that was a surprise to you and your family?
Yes. Yes and no. Yeah, I would say yes. There's no no in there. The education in the years that I grew up and the way children were brought up at home gave children very little initiative on their own to think and to do. You've heard the expression, children are there to be heard, but to be seen and not heard. That's true. That was very true. At dinner time, we were not allowed to speak unless we were asked questions. In school, when I see here the children today, how easy, loose they can conduct themselves with other people, we were not allowed to. We were being taught. We were not taught to think. We were taught by rote lessons. We were not supposed to have ideas of our own. And therefore, politically, as well as from a social point of view, we were not well equipped. We were not able to handle these things very easily. Yes, it came as a surprise. It shouldn't have come as a surprise. We should have been aware of these possibilities, but we didn't think for ourselves. We were just lulling ourselves to sleep with the idea that it won't happen to us.
Well, you mentioned that people were fleeing Germany and coming to even your town. Did you meet anyone? Were you familiar with people who came?
Yes.
Could you tell us some about that?
Well, in the city of Deventer, where I lived in those days, was a center that was training young, not only young, but Jewish refugees from other countries into farm labor, so that with the idea it would go eventually to Israel and start developing farms there. Israel, there was no Israel, it was Palestine in those days, but it was a barren country where nothing was growing. It was infertile, it was a lot of sand, and all these young Chalutzim, which were the young people doing this, were trained there and in the hope eventually to go to Palestine to start farming there and convert the arid soil into fertile land. I knew quite a number of those young people because I was already what was an exception. At a young age of 16 or 17, I was already a Zionist. Zionism meaning in the sense there that, hey, we would like to have a country of our own which we can build up and live in peace without having to be afraid of outside influences. It is not what it is so often painted to be, and looking for the word, diabolic getting together of Jews of all over the world to conquer and rule. But yes, I grew up as a lot of those young people, and as a matter of fact, my younger brother came to this country because one of his German friends came here a few months before he did and made him come over. And
a German Jewish friend?
Yes.
That he had met, who was a fleeing refugee?
In this organization.
But this was in the late 30s?
No. These young people, many of them couldn't go to Palestine. The British wouldn't let them in. And then, of course, the war broke out, so they stayed all these years in Holland. He came in 45 and 46, and my brother came a few years thereafter.
But as far as the refugees who were coming to Holland, was this during the 30s?
During the 30s, yeah.
Okay. These people were coming.
Yeah.
Well, you want to continue telling us about, you mentioned on May 10th, you woke up to the surprise of...
As far as I'm concerned, that part of the war was over. We were now in occupied territory, and it took 5 years to get back to liberation.
Well, if you can remember that day, tell us what happened and how did
life change.
Oh,
it was a beautiful spring day. It was gorgeous weather and clear blue sky. Couldn't be nicer. Weather was in the 70s that day, I'm sure, even though we figured it out in centigrades. But all we saw was the German troops going across the river. A bridge was blown up, the railroad and footbridge was blown up. The other bridge across the river was a, what's the word for it, a pontoon bridge. Don't forget, in 1940, automobile traffic was not near as bad as it is today. We were bicycle riding, we were walking quite often. Still a lot of horses and wagons around. Not that many automobiles, but the pontoon bridge was taken out and ruined, so there was no more getting across the river. However, the Germans went through it, and they had boats, and they fixed it up in such a way that he could go across anyway. So you could see their tanks and their vehicles and their soldiers marching across the bridge going to the western part of Holland. Now, I think a little bit naive looking back. The Dutch army was not the best army in the world. All young men of 18 years of age had to serve in the army in those days for about a year and a half and get a rigorous training, like making long marches. They were very poorly equipped. As a matter of fact, there were not even enough guns for them, and the guns that they had dated back to from the first, not from the First World War, from the German-French War from 1870. They had long, very heavy guns, and that's how. However, the Dutch were thinking, if we submerge part of the land, and a good part of the land in Holland has been taken from the sea and is below sea level. If we flood it, the Germans cannot take it. So they flooded that country. The whole war lasted 5 days. The Germans took a bunch of airplanes and flattened Rotterdam, the major port for Holland and for Europe. They flattened it, and that meant that the Dutch immediately gave up. It is senseless to continue fighting if you don't have anything to fight with.
As a young man, did you serve in the Dutch army?
No, because I was in school still till my 19th year, and therefore I had a deferment.
Okay.
But after the war, I served for a little while. Not after the war, after the liberation.
Okay. Well, how did your daily life change after the Germans occupied Holland?
Well, the first few months, the Germans were too busy with winning a war and waging a war. They didn't have time yet to start with the civil population. But gradually, after a few months, they started tightening up, a little bit at a time. Very cleverly done, but it took a while before you started realizing what was happening. First, Jews were not permitted in the movie theaters. There was a little sign on the Jews not allowed. From a little while later, the Dutch, well, not the Dutch government, but the Nazi Dutch government started issuing ID cards. If you were Jewish, they put a big J on there, Jew. You were not allowed later on in restaurants. A little while later, Jewish kids could not go to public schools. Jews and Jewish kids could not go to non-Jewish doctors. There was a curfew. There was a special curfew for Jews. The regular population could not leave the house after 11 o'clock at night. Jews were not allowed outside after 7 o'clock. Many of these things were negligible. You can live with it. It's only unpleasant. But the bigger things came a little while later. First, you couldn't have an automobile or a horse or a cart. Then you couldn't have a bicycle. The bicycles were taken away. You were not allowed to have a radio. All the radios were confiscated. Money, any bank accounts that you might have, or stocks and bonds, had to be deposited in a certain bank, in one bank only, that was being controlled by the Nazis. And gradually they tightened it very, very badly. Jews could only go to stores, let's say for instance to buy vegetables, between 5 and 6 in the evening, meaning that after everybody else had bought out what was available that day, then you could buy the wilted lettuce or the rotten tomatoes, if there was any.
Well, since you had not grown up in an anti-Semitic society, was this a shock to you?
No, not really. It was not a shock because you knew it existed. You knew it existed in Germany. You were told before the war in the papers and the radio that what the German Jews were going through. So you knew it was there. It was not a shock. It was only not an easy way of living anymore.
Well, how did you feel and respond to this, clamping down on your
It's quite obvious that you hated anything that was German. The Dutch are not, by and large, anti-Semitic at all. Germans much more, and then of course the Poles and the Russians are very, and many of the Balkan countries are very anti-Semitic. The Dutch were not. That doesn't mean that no Dutch was not pro-German or pro-Nazi. There was about 2% of the Dutch population was National Socialists, Nazis, National Socialists. 2% of the population, but that 2% would make your life that miserable. And gradually, as I say, the noose was tightened. In 1942, mind you, I wasn't married. I had known the lady who is now my wife already since 1938. We had been dating all these years. We had been engaged, but not having a job. Incidentally, Jews could not have any jobs in any place. There was no income. We were all moved, and I'm jumping from one thing to the next one, but it is part of it. We were relocated. We couldn't live in our own homes anymore. We were told we had to move in a certain area, a ghetto.
How did your non-Jewish friends that you had grown up with, how did they respond to this, tightening up?
Well, a few all of a sudden didn't know you anymore, but most of them took it in stride and didn't pay attention to it. Of course, we had to start wearing a star on our outer clothes too. Anytime we were outside, we had to wear a star with a yellow star, the Star of David, with the name Jew in there. But
you were telling me about the ghetto.
Well, I'll come back to that in a while, if I may.
Sure.
In 1942, early 42, mind you, we didn't know anything about concentration camp or slave labor camp. We had heard some conversation about it, but it was being poo-pooed. It couldn't be that, couldn't exist. But all information was controlled, so you really didn't know about it. In 1942, we heard that Jewish young men, unmarried, had to go to labor camps for war production. That was what we're told. And I told myself, like hell, I think I'll go. I got married. But I hadn't been, we didn't get married in the beginning because there was no future for us. We had no income, we had no jobs, we had nothing to look forward to except years of war. And if the war would last, we wouldn't survive. So we decided to get married because unmarried men were the ones that were called away. So of course we married in July, late July 42, and it was a very simple wedding, incidentally, but I'll tell you about that also. Of course, it didn't last very long because 3 months later, all married men without children had to go to labor camps. So that was the only choice we then had, is to go in hiding, which we did right then. And I'll come to the hiding in a little while, but first let me go back, if I may, to the wedding. My wife and I lived in different cities, about 4 or 5 hours away from each other. However, she was working in a Jewish orphanage in the western part of Holland. I lived in the eastern part of Holland. Her parents and her home was in the northern part of Holland. Now, Holland is only a little bitty country, so at east, west, north, and south, it sounds bigger than it actually is. But distances were quite considerable in those days, especially because communications and transportation was not available. So she got a pass to go home for her wedding for 3 days. That means 1 day travel, 1 day to get married, and 1 day to go back to work. And I got the same 3 days, 1 day to travel up, 1 day to get married, 1 day to go back to my home. So after we got married, we never even stayed together, lived with each other. We were only married as a piece of paper so that I didn't have to go to camp. However, after the call came, we had to go in hiding. Then eventually we got together and were in hiding together.
So your family, before you got married, your family was forced to live in one of the ghettos?
No. 2 weeks later they would have, but we didn't. It was just before that time. They were getting ready to make all these moves, and a lot of people had already been moved, but they hadn't gotten to us yet.
And so what did you do?
We went in hiding.
You left. Okay, so the ghettos didn't begin until 42 then? Is that what you're saying?
In my town.
In your town?
Not.
Okay.
In other cities, especially in the bigger centers like Rotterdam and Amsterdam, it started much earlier.
Okay, so that prompted you to do something. Okay. So then after you got married, when did you go into hiding?
In September, October 42. Now, this is maybe not a very friendly way of expressing it, but going in hiding, going underground, there are different ways of doing it. There were people in Holland, many people in Holland, who would gladly help you for humane reasons. They would do it without any money, without any recognition, without any thanks. They were doing it because their heart or their religion or both told them to do so. Then there was a group who would do it strictly for the money, only for the money, see how much they could get out of it. It's no different, it's everywhere the same story. There's a group of people who did it, well, in the hope that in the future when the war is over, this person who is now president of the XYZ company may give him a good job when the war is over. He didn't do it for the money now, but for the possibility later on. Those were three possibilities, and the first one that we went into was a family. Mind you, we had no job and therefore no income. This was a family that, a husband and wife, no children. He was a plain laborer somewhere. And I don't mean plain laborer as something to look down upon, but as an explanation of what his position was. He did it strictly for the money. And a small home, we were up in the attic, my wife and I, and didn't get out. Once in a great while, we might at night in the dark before the end of the curfew walk around the block to get some fresh air and then come back. Scared stiff that the neighbors may hear and find out, because you never knew who a neighbor might be, and mention it to the Nazis, Gestapo or the SD. It lasted about 3 months, 4 months, and it was impossible. The demands on us, they squeezed.
How were you able to pay them?
From some money that we had been able to save. But after 4 months, 3-4 months, it became impossible, and we knew that staying there, the demands only would get bigger. They would ask more, and if we couldn't do it anymore, they would gladly turn us over. So we decided to go away from there.
What about the rest of your family? Now you're with your wife at this point. What about your
all were
everybody just
spread out.
So you weren't in contact then?
No,
with your family?
No contact. In a little village about 20-30 miles away, we had some people that we knew, and they made arrangements for us to go with another family, a young couple, husband, wife, with one little child, 2-3-year-old child. He was a foreman in a candy factory. Nice people, and they did it out of sympathy as well as money. They couldn't afford not to do it for money because their income was not big enough. So they had to have some money, but they did it primarily because of pity, sympathy. Till the man was called away to start building airfields for the Germans. Now the wife is by herself with the baby. She couldn't handle it. And after a couple of 3 months, that came to an end. So,
could you tell us about how you find out about people, this network? How do you find out who is willing to hide?
It is not a network, but through acquaintances, through friends that you can contact. Mind you, even though I was in hiding, that didn't mean that I couldn't get a message to a non-Jewish friend or say, hey, we need help, what can you do? Can you meet me tomorrow night at 8 o'clock on the corner of XYZ Street? And we could talk about it, and we could get arrangements made. But after these 2 cases, I've decided that there's no way that I can come to the end of the war. And I could see the war lasting still quite a bit. While everybody else said, oh, the war is going to be over in December, or the war is going to be over before Easter, and things like that. I couldn't see the war ending that soon. I saw the might of the Germans, and not knowing what the Allies could put up, I still saw how powerful they were and how they controlled that whole area, and I knew it had to last. And finally I started thinking on my own. I made then the decision, we cannot do it anymore like this. I found somewhere in the woods, away from the civilized world, excuse me, a little wooden, call it a chalet if you want to give it a big word, a cabin in the woods, no electricity, no running water, but a pump outside, the well, light at candles or carbide. And for heat, we had a stove, and we chopped wood, chopped trees up. That's where we stayed. We had contact then with some people outside who would provide us with rations and with food.
And this was just you and your wife?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the beginning, for the first couple of years. And that's how we lived as a husband and wife under a different name with false identity. But the identity papers, they were so bad, if anybody had looked at it, would have known immediately as falsified. Only kidding myself.
So your only contact was with your friends that brought you?
No. I had a first cousin in a little village not too far away from there who was married to a non-Jewish wife. Because he was married to a non-Jewish wife, he was allowed to stay much longer than anybody else. He was legally staying at home and doing things. So we were, through his wife, in touch with him and back and forth, and that's how we got a lot of things done. How we got, well, clothes we didn't get, but we didn't need any anyway, no more than what we had. But we got food and the bare necessities. Also, my cousin was active in the Dutch resistance. And of course, before long, I started participating myself. And for a couple of years, I've been active in the resistance in Holland.
Well, now, how did you make this transfer from living in this cabin in the woods to becoming involved in the Dutch resistance?
That was very easy. Every little village, every little town had a resistance group.
Well, tell us more about how that worked.
You got a message, hey, tonight at 9 o'clock we're going to go and blow up the city hall in whatever little town it may be. We're going to rob them from their distribution cards or their ID cards, or we're going to blow up a train if we can. So at 9 o'clock you had to be there and participate. Oh yeah, you could, if you had good reasons, not participate also, or if there were, but that's how things were done. It was very unorganized. Almost each group was on its own. And that was also the reason eventually, while we, toward the end of the war, got caught by the Germans, while it was only pure bad luck that we got caught. It had nothing to do with anything that we had been involved in.
Well, how long did you work with the resistance?
About 2 years, give or take it, maybe a few more, a few less. We got some good friends through those years. Some were ardent communists, and the communists, of course, hated the Nazis. Well, there was a good political reason for them to fight them, and they were idealistic people, very idealistic. They had an idea that the world would be better if everybody lived the communistic way. Maybe if it had been done the way Karl Marx had foreseen it at one time, it might have worked. Who knows? But some of the communists were good friends of ours. Some of the very staid Dutch religious people did it out of conviction and became very close friends of ours. No complaints about any of that. It was.
Did your wife participate?
No.
Was it only
not much.
men?
Pardon?
Was it only men?
No, it was not only men, but it was primarily men. But one of the things by being involved with the underground, with the resistance, was that if the Germans or the Dutch Nazis were planning a raid in a certain area or for a certain purpose, we got a warning beforehand, and we could disappear somewhere in the woods or in underground or wherever, really underground. But that's how we were able to survive all that time.
Could you tell us some more about your experiences during these 2 years with the resistance?
Well, it was not much more than an experience in itself. It was not a good way to live. You didn't have newspapers, you didn't have radio, you didn't have anything. You had bare necessities to live on. You didn't get out of the woods, but except very infrequent, maybe once every 2 or 3 months that you might see somebody from the outside, unless there was some action that you had to participate in. That it was not much of an experience, except it was an experience.
How often did you participate in these activities?
Oh, infrequent, because, as I said, we were in the woods in Holland, in a certain part of the country where it is not densely populated, and only little villages around there, and those resistance groups were not all that active. There was a lot of planning going into those things, and if one of those things failed, it meant immediately a raid by the Nazis, and everybody had to lay low for a while before they could dare to come up and think of something else again.
Were you ever involved in the planning?
No, only in the execution.
And then at what point, you mentioned that you got caught, the Germans found you.
Well,
do you know how that happened?
Yes, I know how it happened. The business part of Holland, the heavy populated part of Holland, is the western part. And it's where most of the population lives, most of the factories are, all the cities are, Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam, Delft, all the major cities, not all the major cities, but many of the major cities are like here between Boston and Washington, a big industrialized and heavily populated area. It is there the same way in the western part of Holland is where the concentration of people is. So also that's where the coast is, the North Sea. And of course the Germans were very careful to protect the coast because of worry of a possible invasion along the coast. So they were digging bunkers all over there and heavily arming the coast so that they would be prepared in case there would be a landing. Holland is almost cut in half, not quite, but there is a river, a branch of the River Rhine, the same branch of the River Rhine that flows through my hometown, flows north-south, or south-north. And there are only 4 bridges crossing that river, enabling the Germans going by rail from Germany to Holland, or Holland to Germany. 3 of the 4 were, toward the end of the war, blown up. There was only one little line left over. That one bridge and that one little single railroad track was not too far from where we were in hiding. Now, if I lived here, if there was a little village here and I belonged to the resistance here, there was a little village here. And they had a separate resistance group. The two of them had no coordination between them. The railroad line is here, and we live here somewhere in between. So one night, the group in this village decided to blow up the railroad track. Unfortunately, the charge didn't go off. Next morning, the Germans discovered it. They took 8,000 or 10,000 men, and they started combing the countryside to find the culprits, the man who had placed those charges. Everybody they could find would be arrested. There was no warning coming from this group because they didn't know about it, they didn't know of the attempt, they didn't know what the other people had been doing, and they didn't therefore know that it was discovered. So there was no warning. One morning I was pumping water at the well outside the house, and all of a sudden I was surrounded. I couldn't get away. My wife was sick, was in bed, was expecting a baby, and couldn't get away either, so the two of us were then arrested. However, my commanding officer of the resistance heard, saw, jumped out of the back window and got away. We had a transmitter going at that time to the Allied forces. We had thousands of ID cards that were stolen. We had tens of thousands of ration cards that were stolen, all hidden in the house. So when the Germans found those, I figured that we bought it.
Well, now I want to go back for just a minute and understand how you transformed from this house. It was you and your wife at first, and then when you were captured, it was a storehouse for many different things from the resistance, and other people lived there.
No other people lived there, except my commanding officer.
Okay, so there are the three of you that were living there. Okay.
At that time. He had to run from where he had been in hiding at that time. He came to us to stay, to lay low, to be out of sight for a little while, not with the idea to stay with us forever. And he had been only with us maybe 4 or 6 weeks.
And how long had you been storing these IDs and miscellaneous letters?
On and off. It came and it went and it went and it came. We had hand grenades, German hand grenades, about 24 of them stored under the roof. The house was taken down board by board by the Germans, and they found, of course, everything, and that was...
And when was this?
This was in February 45.
And then what happened that day after they captured you?
Let me go back for 1 second in history. In, I think it was September 44, after the invasion in France, of course, after D-Day, the Allied troops marched through northern France, southern France too. They had a landing near Marseille. They came out through Belgium and in southern Holland. You remember? No, you don't remember, but I'm sure you've read about the effort that was made. 10,000 paratroopers were let down in the Arnhem area to enable the Allied troops to cross the bridges. There were the 3 major rivers that had to be crossed: the Waal, the Meuse, and the Rhine. And they were landed just across the Rhine. They were butchered by the Germans. It was a miscalculation of the strength of the German army by the Allied forces. But in the meantime, the front was now only 25 miles, 40 kilometers from where we were. The Germans were fleeing in disarray. We saw them going. That was a sight to behold. It was one of the nicest things I've seen in my life, is the fleeing of the Germans on horseback, on bicycles, on carts, you name it. But the paratroopers were beaten back, beaten down, and the Germans rearranged them cells, and they went back to the front a few days later. At that time, southern Holland was liberated and stayed under Allied control. The western, the eastern, and the northern part of Holland were not. And now comes the cold, brutal winter of 1945. The Germans denied the Dutch any food, any clothing, any fuel for heating. People were being starved to death. Tens of thousands of people died from hunger. It became an extra cold winter on top of it. And Holland suffered terribly in those years, very badly. However, we were still sitting there. We were not getting fat, but we were still eating a little bit, and we still had a roof over our head. When we were caught, we first went to the local police jail. A couple of days later, we were taken to the big German barracks in garrison in a nearby town, about 15 kilometers away. The men downstairs, women upstairs. I never heard from my wife anymore till much later. While she was there, I didn't know whether she was alive or not alive.
Now this is in what year?
This was in early 45.
Okay.
February 45.
After you had been caught?
Yeah.
Okay.
In February 45, I was then in this in these barracks, in the garrison, and they had, which was just slightly out of town, and the Gestapo and the SS had their headquarters in town. Oh, there were maybe 100 prisoners, male prisoners, in prison. I was in a cell that was made for one man with 16 prisoners. No light, there was no daylight. There was no artificial light. There was a little straw on the floor to sleep on. There was no water, there was no toilet, there was a bucket. Food consisted of a cup of, well, they called it soup, but it was not soup, it was boiled potatoes, boiled potato peelings. No salt, no pepper, no nothing. Just a little potato peelings. They were boiled, they made a soup out of it. That was your dinner with a small piece of bread. That small piece of bread you had to break in two. One you could have for dinner, so you had something to eat for the next morning. And you had a kind of a gruel, a watery substance that was lunch, if you were lucky enough. Well, if the SS wanted to question you, and the Gestapo, they would take those prisoners who had to go in for questioning in a truck. Of course, they handcuff them all together and ship them to headquarters in town, where you had to spend all day on your knees, without food, without water, without being able to use the bathrooms. And the most cruel treatment was doled out there. Very, very bad. We were lucky, if you can call it lucky. I was up there for questioning on one day, when that day the Dutch resistance group south of this town where we were knew that the commander of the German police was coming through, and they killed him on the highway. Well, not at that very moment, but eventually he died of his wounds. But they shot him and several other people. As a retaliation, the prison where we were was emptied out and all men taken to that place where this German officer was waylaid and shot to death, right there on the spot. However, I was not there. I was in questioning at headquarters. When I came back that night with 7 or 8 other men, we were the only survivors. That's how we survived one time. And then a few days later, you could hear the war coming closer. And
so you were the only people left then
yeah.
in this camp?
Well, it didn't last long. They started bringing more prisoners in. But,
and you had no contact with your wife at this point?
No, I didn't even know where she was or whether she was there. And she, of course, in reverse. She, I found out later, was transported to a Dutch concentration camp. We were in prison, which is different. It is nothing but cells, to a concentration camp, which is a different concept entirely. And she was in that concentration camp, didn't know whether I was alive or dead. And I didn't know she was there or that she was alive or dead. However, when the war came closer, the Germans started packing up their stuff and taking their prisoners with them. And after a 4-day trip for a distance of maybe 60 miles, traveling only at night so that the Allied Air Force couldn't see us and strafe us, they brought us to a concentration camp in Northern Holland. In Northern Holland. Of course, I can't say that we were the cleanest looking or the nicest smelling bunch of people that ever came off a truck. It was terrible. We were dirty, we stank, full of lice and all that kind of good stuff. In the camp we were unloaded, and one of the policemen, when I say police, these were prisoners being used as police, as order keepers. A German Jewish prisoner had been there for 5 years, 6 years, and recognized me, pulled me out and said, "Your wife is here, she's well, I'll get her for you." So after delousing and steam baths and being shaved from top to toe, and I tell you something, the shaving is not the nicest experience, because there was no soap, no brush, and only a very dull 1755 times used Gillette was used to shave your body hairs, and it was very painful. We got a piece of cloth thrown to us, and that was our uniform. We got a number, not in the arm, but we got a number on the arm.
And so this
So
is
I found my wife.
mid-45, and you found your wife at this camp.
We found each other, but of course then she was in an entirely different part of the camp. Where I was kept, I had to go to work every day. She had to go to work every day. She had to work in, cutting things for uniforms for the German army. And first I had to work in the crematorium. Now the crematorium there was not used, let me rephrase that. There was a crematorium for burning corpses, obviously, but this was not a destruction camp. Only those people who died for certain reasons were being cremated there, but not cremated and in masses like would happen in Bergen-Belsen or Auschwitz or the Polish and German camps. But after I worked there a few days, I was told to go to work on the farm. That meant I had to get up every morning at 5:30, which is no big deal, march for an hour and a half without food to a field, and there under German guards, of course. We had to work all day long in the open. By 5 o'clock we had to march back, come back at 6:30, wash up, eat quickly, whatever there was, if you could get something to eat, and by 7 o'clock It was lights out. That was a routine.
Now you
7 days a week.
You mentioned earlier when y'all got caught, your wife was pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, was she still pregnant at this point?
Oh, yes. She was then, I would say, in her early 7th month. We were liberated by the Canadians mid-April, April 12th. And my daughter was born in July, mid-July. So she was in her 7th month.
She was pregnant throughout this experience.
Yeah. Very much so. Well, it was very big. All water.
Did you see her very often?
No, very seldom. But at the end, when the end was in sight, the Germans all of a sudden turned around and became a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more cooperative, and they knew that if the Allies would ever catch him, and they heard and saw what had been going on,